Yeah, I had the studio done up to look like my friend's apartment in Long Beach. I just thought it'd be fun for a change of pace. Two, three, four. Beep, beep, boop, 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 boop. Ba da ba 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 ba. Ba da ba 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 ba. Hi, everybody. How would you like some picks of the week? Ba da ba da ba da. All right. Folks, you may think you're dedicated to your job, but until you're willing to ride public transportation from Long Beach to Van Nuys, and I question not only your dedication to your job, but to life in general. All right. So this week, sorry, I've been on public transportation today for a total of 6 to 7 hours, and my only regret is that I can't do it for 12 to 13 hours a day. 26 hours a day would be even better. I digress. So first up this week, we got Little Monsters #1. I don't know what it's about. I'm assuming it's got something to do with monsters. It looks like a horror book. It's by Jeff Lemire and Dustin Nguyen, which is the creative team that did Ascender or Descender and then Ascender. Try not to shake the table too much. Looks like it might be a vampire thing or something. Lemire has got he's got like a whole horror imprint at Dark Horse coming out pretty soon. I think Andrea Sorrentino is doing those with him, who's another collaborator. Him and Nguyen obviously have done two like long-term comics. I don't know if this is going to be a mini or if this is going to be another ongoing. But they do good work together. And Lemire is just a machine. I mean, the guy has been doing comics, I want to say, at least 15 years. Probably a little bit more than that. And he just shows no signs of letting up. And he's got Netflix money now. I'm sure he doesn't really have to... I mean, I don't know how much he got for Sweet Tooth. I never even watched it, but I also know that Netflix has got money to burn, so I'm sure he's doing okay. I'm never 100% sure how much creative control of Vertigo, because Sweet Tooth was on Vertigo originally, which is a DC imprint. And then when the show came out, they did another miniseries, which was just DC. It might have been Black Label. Vertigo is long gone. And I always thought that the thing with Vertigo was that it was a creator control. That was a big deal back in the early 90s, was for creators to control, even though in some cases, like Swamp Thing, that wasn't Alan Moore's to begin with. But like Sandman, even though Sandman was... I'm getting off on a tangent. Sorry. I'm just dozing off. My point was just that Jeff Lemire is, again, the theme tonight is dedication, and Jeff Lemire is dedicated to his craft, and they're all good. It's all good stuff. There's been like Family Tree I dropped, Gideon Falls did I finish it? I liked it, but I had to make room for some other stuff. But I mean, that's 2 titles off the top of my head that I haven't bought by Jeff Lemire in the last 15 years. That's pretty good. Also this week, Hit Me #1 from the AWA publisher. This is another book from AWA by my buddy Krista Faust, even though we haven't spoken in some time. Still consider her, at the very least, a colleague. I don't know what this one's about either. It's got a pretty lady in it. That's almost always true with Krista's work. I don't recognize the artists here either, but it'll be good. Krista is never disappointed, especially when this looks like it might be a more straight up crime thing than as opposed to the last couple more sci-fi things she did for AWA. And now what I've been looking forward to for a couple years now, The Punisher #1. This is volume Lucky 13, if I'm not mistaken. This is the 13th series The Punisher has had. It's written by Jason Aaron, who last wrote The Punisher. Gosh, I wrote it up for my little thing for my little write-up for the shop, and now I don't remember. He wrote an arc of Punisher Max I guess that must have been, yeah, '09, 2010, around in there somewhere. So back in the late '90s, early 2000s, when Garth Ennis took over the Punisher, he hogged the Punisher to himself. I think in his second run, which would be the Punisher Volume 5, if I'm correct, there was a couple fill-in issues that he did not write, but pretty much every Punisher comic from 1999 until, yeah, about two years, about 10 years, it was all Ennis. And at one point, Ennis's Punisher was so much its own world that they just moved it. They gave him the Max line, and I think until that point, if there had been Max comics before, they weren't much to speak of. So it was a line, an imprint more or less created, I think, for Garth Ennis to do the Punisher stories he wanted to do without a bad hair day or without, so he could have all the swearing and violence that he wanted. And then that was probably the bulk of the series. And somewhere along that line, somewhere during that run, they brought a different Punisher back into 616. So you have your mainstream continuity Punisher, where he's been since the mid 70s. Ennis came along and it started there, but then he kind of slowly pulled it over into kind of an alternate universe where time kind of, like, he's older and Nick Fury was older, but they were still very tough. And then while that was going on, during, I think it was, yeah, it was during Civil War, that they brought Punisher, like Frank Castle, the more, the less dark, no, more superhero friendly Punisher. And then once I think that series wrapped up, that kind of, well, that doesn't matter because that just kind of went on its own. The Max series was still going. Garth Ennis finished with that, yeah, late aughts, early teens. He still revisits the character every now and again. Sometimes it's in a Max book, sometimes not. It's been a while since he's done Punisher, but when he quit, they wanted to keep, for some reason, they wanted to keep Punisher Max going. Well, that was it, and that was at a time too when the Max line, there was a lot of stuff. They had a Deadpool Max, they had a bunch of Squadron Supreme books, that some of which weren't great, but some of them were really good. I don't think they have any Max books these days. I don't remember what the last one was, but they gave it to Jason Aaron. Jason Aaron had to follow Garth Ennis, and he did a pretty good job. I mean, it's a tough act to follow, especially from that era. So now Jason Aaron is back, but this is 616 Punisher, and I don't know if I've mentioned it, but I feel like now would be the time. So as you can see here, this is the classic Punisher logo. They are changing that logo effective this series. In this series, Frank becomes the leader of the Hand, which is the evil ninja clan that's long been an enemy of Daredevil's. And they've changed his, you don't see it here obviously, but they've changed his logo to make it look more ninja-like, I guess. And this is all just an educated guess on my part because I don't really read up on these sorts of things, but I am under the impression that they are changing the Punisher's logo to come in to distance the property further from the police, for lack of a better word. The Punisher logo has been co-opted by your militaristic right-wing types, largely the police, but I hasten to point out, as I always do whenever this subject arises, and in my day-to-day it arises a lot, that logo that you see on the backs of SUVs and, with the American flag with the blue line in it, that Punisher logo is from the 2004 Thomas Jane film. It is not from the comics, and I know that's pretty thin gruel, but it is. I mean, I'm going to stick to it. That is there is a difference. This is the Punisher logo originally, and this has not been. And I know to the undiscerning eye it looks exactly the same, but I'm a little defensive because I love the Punisher and always have done. But this just promises. I mean, it's been a couple of years since the Punisher's had his own book. I mean, nobody this has probably been the longest periods between Punisher books. And unless I'm very much mistaken, the last one was the one that Becky Cloonan was writing and that Steve Dillon was drawing, and it was the last thing he did. That can't be right, because that would have been like 2015. I thought that was... Yeah. No. I think Matt Rosenberg's Punisher was after that. I honestly can't remember now. I am shredded. But, yeah, good Punisher. It's back. Good. Picks of the week. Picks of the last week. Alright. So before we get to the Cerebus Hour, I also, for last week, I don't even think I had bought this when I did the video last week, but I also read last week Strange #1. This is the new Doctor Strange title. Doctor Strange is dead after the events of the death of Doctor Strange. I hope I didn't spoil. It's right in the title. And now his ex-wife Clea from the Dark Dimension has become the Sorcerer Supreme of Earth. And this is great. I've always thought Clea should be used a lot more. So, I mean, she was used so much back in the 70s and even in the 80s and 90s that I think after the last book, I don't even remember when they got split up. And Clea has been around. I mean, that was the other thing, is Doctor Strange didn't have a title for probably a decade before that movie came out, and then they started making Doctor Strange comics again. Anyway, so Clea is now the Sorcerer Supreme, and she's quite a badass, in fact. This is really fun, and her #1 goal is to try to bring Stephen Strange back to life. We'll see how well that goes. This is #1, but legacy number 417, which means in about 8 issues there will be another oversized, and maybe that'll be when they bring Stephen Strange back, since that'll be like the end of this year. It won't be long before they bring him back, especially because he's got another movie coming out pretty soon. But yeah, it was fun. But on to the main event, the next 2 Cerebus phone books. So I read Guys. This is officially my second favorite phone book after High Society, and it's close. Not since High Society has Dave done a book that's just more fun than anything. And I think it's really well placed. I mean, there's everything about this book is good. Because the previous major arc, which consisted of 4 phone books, was Mothers and Daughters. So naturally, Guys is the next one. And at the end of Minds, I had to go back and remind myself, but at the end of the previous arc, it was Mothers and Daughters, which goes Flight, Women, Reads, Minds. So at the end of Minds, Cerebus finds himself on Pluto or Juno. I always thought Juno was Jupiter, but I could be wrong. Juno might be Pluto's moon, actually, now I'm thinking about it. And Cerebus had been stranded there by Dave at the end of Minds, and the whole time Cerebus is trying to get off, all he can think of is that he wants to go. There's a tavern next to the Wall of Sea in Astarcion in Lower Felda, because I think now Upper Felda has been obliterated. There's a tavern there that he used to hang out with Bear, who is one of his like generals when he was Pope. And he's like, if I get off of here, that's all I want. I don't want Jaka back. I don't want any of that. I just want to hang out. And that's what he does. And it's a lot of fun. It really... In the intro, Dave talks about there was a bar in Kitchener called Peter's Place. I think it was Kitchener. I think that's where Dave lives. And, yeah. He was a regular for 10 years. And so a lot of this, I think, is just... And I used to hang out. I used to be a barfly in my 20s into my 30s, but really just my 20s, I would say. 21 to about 31 sounds about right. Where I would just hang out in bars all the time. And I didn't quit drinking until I was 36, but I had quit bar hopping by the time I was probably 31 or so. But this brought it all back. And just hanging out. So in the world of Cerebus now, Siren is still, after the ascension, the upper city of Felda was destroyed, I guess. And Siren is returned to reclaim her role as matriarch. But the Sirenists do not come into it very often. But the way they have the society set up is that men are allowed, drinking is allowed. Not a lot, vices are allowed, but the Sirenists go, okay, if you're an unmarried man, you can go to taverns and drink for free. You can live there because you can't leave unless you're sober. And so Cerebus and a handful of other characters that we've known include Prince Mick and Prince Keith, who showed up first in Church and State, are in this. But then there's new characters that he introduces, like a Marty Feldman character. There's two characters based on the Beatles, Harrison Starkey and Richard George. So it's George and Ringo. And then a bunch of other Bear is there. Booba, who was his scribe when he was Pope. He only shows up for a minute. The Marty Feldman character is there the most, and it's mostly Bear and Mick. But then Too Much Coffee Man shows up. There's a bunch of more, a lot of inside baseball 90s indie comics. But that's, again, right up my alley. Some of them I didn't recognize, but Eddie Campbell himself is a character, as is Bacchus, which was also a character of his. And it's honestly, like I say, it's just them hanging out. And so, right, so they're allowed to drink for free. They can live there. They can't leave unless they're sober. So living there is, they can just drink themselves to death, which is how the Sirenists are very like, this is how we get rid of the more unsavory members of the male gender. And so it's really fun. And the thing of it is, though, and this is with stories like this that I always have a problem with, it always comes to an end. And that's kind of like, I think Dave was kind of getting at that with his own kind of drinking days. Because he went completely teetotaler around this time, I want to say. This would have been the late 90s. And it's one of those things, though, that it does kind of have to come to an end. So Cerebus is hanging out there with all these other idiots. And then eventually they all get to a point where, like, well, that's the other, Bear, who's like his best friend, even though he treats him like shit. Bear falls in love and gets married. So does Marty. And then a bunch of all the guys just leave. And then there's just Cerebus. And that's how it ends. And it's kind of depressing. But as Dave says in the intro, never fall in love with a bar, which I think is very salient advice. When I was in my bar hopping days, my drinking days, a big part of it was the camaraderie. And it was looking for a place where I fit in and where everybody knew my name, just like in the song. And you could try to get laid, and you could complain to your friends about girls and all that sort of thing. But yeah, you realize, I mean, I learned pretty early on that there was a difference between your real friends and your bar friends. But yeah, there comes a time. That's the thing too, is that Dave's continuing war with the female gender really picks up here, because Bear's fiance, Ziggy, is really all the female characters are at this point absolute caricatures. And it's like, it's one of those things where, like, when I was a teenager, I would hear, like you hear it in popular culture songs and movies and TV shows, and sometimes you hear older dudes, I would hear say these sorts of things like, women, they change their mind whenever they want, or they'll turn anything into a fight, and things like that. And then as I grew older, I was like, oh, I've had experiences like that, but you're not talking about real things that happen. People don't really do shit like this, which is kind of where I come down on that part of guys. Fortunately, it's not a major part of it, I don't think. And then so Cerebus is left kind of just feeling sorry for himself. And then Rick shows up. So Rick is the ex-husband of Jaka, and who we have not seen in the book since the end of Jaka's story. Rick shows up at the tavern that now Cerebus is the bartender and the only person inside. And Rick has become a writer. And yeah. Right. That's the other thing is in guys is that Cerebus dates Joanne, who that's a long story to get in the back of, but Rick ends up dating her too. Joanne's another female character that's very, I would say, poorly characterized and kind of just comes off cartoonish. She comes off a little more sympathetic than Ziggy ever does because we get to see more of her inner thought processes and stuff. But the main thing to kind of take away for the overall plot of Cerebus from Rick's story is this is when God becomes a character, and so Dave's religious aspect is going to show through. All right, so Rick is losing it, I think, and they don't. That's one thing that was infuriating about this phone book was that a lot of why Rick is such a lunatic, like is having hallucinations, never really addressed. And also by the end of this phone book, he tells Cerebus to go to hell, and we never really see why, because they go from being friendly, and then Cerebus immediately gets sick of him. But then Rick has a hallucination that Cerebus is God. They're also drinking heavily, I should point that out. Rick has a hallucination that Cerebus is the living will of Terran, like the Pope that he once was. And Rick starts writing the scripture of Cerebus. But then Rick meets God, and God's like, don't do any more of that. And Cerebus will eventually reinterpret the Bible for us in real time. So then Rick goes out with Joanne a few times, and she's clearly just doing it to make Cerebus jealous, and it's not really working. Cerebus is mostly hanging around because he wants Bear to come back, and he's convinced that Bear will come back, even though years have gone by. That's the other thing. Guys is years. Guys is like 10 years pass in this. And then so Rick's story is another couple years, I want to say. Right. So Rick and Joanne kind of starts to date, but then Rick immediately doesn't want, like, Joanne and Cerebus have this whole game playing that they do the whole time, and then as soon as she starts it with Rick, he's just kind of like, oh, I'm not going to do that. And then that's around the time when Rick meets God and is like, oh, okay, I don't really. And then, yeah, for whatever reason, he tells Cerebus to go to hell. Joanne storms off. I don't think we're ever going to see her again. And then Dave shows up in person this time, not just a voice in Cerebus's head. But he never tells Cerebus who he is, but then he does leave Missy, Jaka's doll, that Cerebus had lost somewhere in Mothers and Daughters. And then Jaka shows up. But then Jaka shows up right when Bear shows up. And Bear and Richard George and Marty, they have all decided to return finally. And it's been years, like I say, it's been years, and they're all old and fat. And unexpectedly to me, Cerebus goes with Jaka, because the whole book is, it's about how men and women just really shouldn't be together. And Cerebus has sworn off Jaka. But then she shows back up, and they fall back in love. And then his friends show back up, and he has to make the decision between his friends and her. And both of these books, the answer is like, oh, well, he's going to stay with his friends. But he doesn't. He goes off with Jaka. And the next arc will be Going Home, when they go to Cerebus's childhood, where he grew up, and now I can't remember, which I cannot remember. The Sand Hills, something like that. So I'm looking forward to that. The next phone book is the last one that is in print, and then I'm going to have to read the rest online like some kind of an asshole. But we're getting down to, what was the last issue of Rick's story? Was 231. So there are 69 up top books left. Issues left, basically. So okay, well, it's been another half hour of me talking about Cerebus and being very loopy the whole time, so I do apologize. Have a nice night. Okay, goodbye.